Sarah Martinez stepped off the transport truck at forward operating base. Sentinel, with her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and her rifle secured across her back. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty compound, and she could already feel sweat forming under her body armor. 26 years old, 5'6", with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She looked around at what would be her home for the next 8 months. The base was a collection of tan buildings surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire. Soldiers moved between structures with purpose, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with sand filled her nostrils. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the rhythmic thump of a helicopter preparing for takeoff. Sarah had trained for 3 years to get here. She had pushed through every qualification, every test, every challenge the military threw at her. She was a combat medic attached to a special operations unit, one of only a handful of women selected for forward deployment with elite teams. The letter informing her of the assignment had arrived 6 weeks ago. She had read it so many times the paper had become soft at the creases. A sergeant approached her, clipboard in hand. He was a thick man with a sunburned face and eyes that barely glanced at her name tape. Martinez. You're with 3rd Platoon. Barracks are that way. Report to Captain Hendricks at 1600 hours. He pointed toward a building without looking up from his clipboard, then walked away before she could ask any questions. She made her way across the compound. Noting the stares from groups of soldiers she passed, some looked curious. Others looked dismissive. A few nudged each other and whispered. She had expected this. She had experienced it during training, during transport, during every step of her military career. Being a woman in combat zones still drew attention, and not all of it was welcoming. The barracks were a long structure divided into small rooms. She found hers near the end, a space barely large enough for a cot, a locker, and a small desk. The walls were plywood, and she could hear voices from neighboring rooms. She dropped her duffel on the cot and began unpacking her gear, organizing everything with the precision she had learned in basic training. That evening, she reported to Captain Hendricks as instructed. His office was cramped and cluttered with maps, reports, and empty coffee cups. He was a lean man in his 40s with gray threading through his hair and deep lines around. His eyes that spoke of too many deployments. Sit down. Martinez, he said, without looking up from a document he was reading. She sat in the metal chair across from his desk, back straight, hands folded in her lap. He finally looked at her, studying her face for a long moment. You know why you're here? Yes, sir. I'm assigned as a combat medic to provide medical support during operations. That's the official answer. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. The real answer is that higher-ups think having female personnel helps with local population engagement. Hearts and minds and all that. Afghan women won't talk to male soldiers, so they send people like you. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but kept her expression neutral. I'm qualified for combat operations, sir. I've completed all the same training as the male medics. I'm sure you have. His tone suggested he didn't believe that mattered much. But out here, training and reality are two different things. These men have been working together for months. They trust each other. Trust takes time to build. I understand, sir. Do you? He leaned forward, his eyes hardening. Because the men in 3rd Platoon are going to test you. They're going to watch every move you make. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and they'll never trust you. Out here, that can get people killed. I won't let them down, sir. He studied her again, then nodded slowly. Report to Sergeant Davis tomorrow at 0600. He runs the medical operations for the platoon. Dismissed. She stood, saluted, and left his office feeling the weight of his words. She had heard variations of this speech before. Prove yourself. Don't make mistakes. Earn their trust. As if the men around her never made mistakes. As if they had been born with trust already established. The next morning, she found Sergeant Davis in the medical bay, a converted storage room lined with supplies and equipment. He was a compact man with muscular forearms and a shaved head. He looked her up and down when she entered, his expression unreadable. So you're the new medic, he said. It wasn't a question, yes, Sergeant. You ever treat a gunshot wound in combat? Not in active combat, but I've trained extensively in trauma care under stress conditions. He snorted. Training, right? He gestured around the medical bay. This is your workspace. Keep it organized. Keep supplies stocked. When we go out on patrol, you carry your full medical kit plus your weapon in standard gear. Think you can handle that weight? Yes, Sergeant. We'll see. He handed her a thick binder. These are our current medical protocols and evacuation procedures. Memorize them. I'll quiz you tomorrow. She took the binder and spent the rest of the day studying while organizing the medical supplies. Other soldiers came and went, some asking for basic items like pain relievers or bandages. Most barely acknowledged her presence. A few made comments just loud enough for her to hear. Great, they sent us a girl. What's next? Bringing our mothers to war? Hope she doesn't cry when things get loud. She kept her face neutral, her movements professional. She had learned long ago that reacting only made it worse. Better to let them talk and prove herself through action that night in the dining facility. She sat alone at a table with her meal tray. The room was filled with soldiers eating and talking, but no one invited her to join their conversations. She was accustomed to this isolation, but it still stung. She thought about her family back home in California, her mother who worried constantly, her father who had served in the army years ago and understood why she needed to do this. 3 men from 3rd Platoon sat at a nearby table. She recognized them from the barracks area. They were talking loudly, and she caught fragments of their conversation. Heard we got a female medic now, one said. Tiny thing. What's she gonna do if someone goes down and needs to be carried? Probably panic and call for help? I give her 2 weeks before she requests a transfer. Another voice joined in. My buddy in 2nd Platoon had a female attachment last year. She lasted 1 mission. Froze up when they took fire. Had to be sent back. They laughed, and Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She finished her meal quickly and left the dining facility, walking back to her barracks through the cooling evening air. In her small room, she sat on her cot and pulled out a worn photograph from her wallet. It showed her younger brother, Miguel, in his hospital bed 2 years ago. He was smiling despite the 4 lines and monitors. He had been in a car accident that nearly killed him, and she had been there when the paramedics worked on him, when the ER doctors fought to save his life. She had watched them work with such skill and determination, and she had known then what she wanted to do. She wanted to be the person who saved lives when it mattered most. Miguel had survived, though he would never walk the same way again. But he had survived because skilled medical professionals had been there when he needed them. Sarah had joined the military to become that person for others. She had endured every challenge, every dismissal, every doubt because she knew the work mattered more than the comfort of being accepted. She put the photograph away and lay back on her cot, staring at the plywood ceiling. Tomorrow would be another day of proving herself. In the day after that. She had no illusions about how difficult this deployment would be, but she also had no intention of failing. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of routine. She memorized the medical protocols. She trained with her weapon. She went on supply runs around the base. She treated minor injuries and illnesses, always professional, always competent. The men of 3rd Platoon watched her, tested her with questions and scenarios. Waiting for her to fail, Sergeant Davis quizzed her constantly on medical procedures. Sucking chest wound, what's your immediate action? Seal the wound with a vented chest seal, or improvised occlusive dressing. Monitor for tension pneumothorax. Prepare for needle decompression if necessary. Arterial bleeding from the femoral artery. Apply direct pressure. Use tourniquet high and tight on the thigh. Mark time of application. Monitor for shock. Casualty with blast injuries. Multiple trauma. Unconscious. Secure airway. Control catastrophic bleeding. Assess breathing and circulation. Prepare for rapid evacuation. He never praised her correct answers, only grunted and moved to the next question. But she noticed he stopped looking surprised when she got them right. Still, she remained an outsider. The men of 3rd Platoon had their inside jokes, their shared experiences, their bonds forged through previous missions. She was the newcomer, the unknown variable. The woman in a world that still wasn't sure women belonged there at night. Lying in her cot, she sometimes felt the doubt creeping in. Maybe they were right to question her. Maybe she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, tough enough. Maybe she should have chosen a different path, an easier path. But then she would remember Miguel in that hospital bed. She would remember the paramedic who had kept pressure on his wounds during the entire ambulance ride. She would remember the surgeon who had worked for 7 hours to save his leg. She would remember why she was here, and the doubt would recede. On her 15th day at Fob Sentinel, Captain Hendricks called a platoon meeting. Sarah filed into the briefing room with the 30 other members of 3rd Platoon. Maps of the surrounding region covered one wall. A large satellite image was projected on a screen at the front. Captain Hendricks stood before them, his expression grave. Intelligence has located a high-value target in a village 12 kilometers northwest of here. We've been tasked with a direct action mission to capture or eliminate. Mission launches at 0300 tomorrow. This will be full platoon deployment. A murmur ran through the room. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This would be her first combat mission. Hendricks continued with the details. Entry routes, building layouts, rules of engagement, evacuation procedures. Sarah listened intently, committing every detail to memory. She glanced around the room and saw the faces of experienced soldiers, some eager, some calm, all focused. When the briefing ended, soldiers filed out talking in low voices. Sergeant Davis approached her. "You'll be in the 2nd vehicle. Stay close to Lieutenant Morrison's team. When we're on the ground, you don't play hero. You treat casualties and stay out of the way of the shooters. Understood?" "Understood, Sergeant." That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her cot checking and rechecking her medical supplies in her mind. Tourniquets, pressure bandages, chest seals, airways for supplies, medications. Everything she might need to save a life. Everything she had trained for years to use correctly. She thought about her parents, wondered what they would think if they knew she was going into combat tomorrow. Her mother would be terrified. Her father would understand but still worry. She hadn't told them much about her deployment, only that she was serving overseas and was safe. Around 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and began preparing her gear. She laid everything out systematically. Body armor, helmet, weapon, medical kit, ammunition, water, communications equipment. She checked every item twice, then checked again. Other soldiers were stirring now, preparing in the darkness. She heard muffled voices, the clink of equipment, the sound of weapons being checked and loaded. The base was coming alive with the quiet intensity of pre-mission preparation. At 0230, she joined the platoon at the vehicle staging area. 4 armored vehicles sat waiting, engines already running. Soldiers loaded equipment and took their positions. She climbed into the 2nd vehicle as instructed, settling into the cramped interior between 2 large soldiers who barely acknowledged her presence. Captain Hendricks moved between the vehicles, checking on his troops. He stopped at Sarah's vehicle and made eye contact with her through the open door. "Stay alert. Stay safe. Do your job, yes, sir?" The doors closed. The convoy began to move. Sarah felt the rumble of the engine beneath her and the weight of her gear pressing against her body. Around her, the soldiers were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Through the small window, she could see the dark landscape passing by, illuminated occasionally by the vehicle's headlights. This was it. Everything she had trained for. Everything she had endured. In a few hours, she would either prove herself or fail. There would be no middle ground, no second chances. The men of 3rd Platoon would see what she was made of. So would she. The convoy rolled through the darkness for 40 minutes, following rough dirt roads that wound through barren landscape. Sarah's night vision goggles turned the world into shades of green. She could see the vehicle ahead of them, the dust cloud it kicked up. The vast emptiness of the Afghan countryside stretching in all directions. Inside the vehicle, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the engine's rumble and the occasional crackle of radio communications. Sarah focused on controlling her breathing, keeping her heart rate steady. She had trained for high-stress situations, learned techniques to manage fear and maintain focus. Now she put all of that training to use. The convoy slowed as they approached the target village. Through her goggles, Sarah could see mud brick compounds clustered together. Walls surrounding small courtyards, narrow alleyways between buildings. Everything was dark and still. It was nearly 4 in the morning, the quietest time of night. The vehicles stopped half a kilometer from the village. Doors opened and soldiers poured out silently, forming up in their assigned teams. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and weapon, her movements automatic from countless rehearsals. The weight of her gear settled onto her shoulders and back. Easily 70 pounds total. Lieutenant Morrison, a tall man with a thick beard, gathered his team. "We're going in from the east side. Target building is marked on your maps. Martinez, you stick with Corporal Jenkins and Specialist Hayes. They'll keep you positioned correctly. When we hit the compound, you set up in the courtyard and wait for casualties." "Clear? Clear, sir?" Jenkins was a stocky soldier with kind eyes. Hayes was younger, barely 22, with nervous energy radiating from him. Neither had said more than a few words to Sarah in the past 2 weeks, but now Jenkins nodded at her. "Stay between us. If shooting starts, get behind cover and stay there until we call for you." The platoon moved toward the village in tactical formation, weapons ready, every sense alert. Sarah moved with Jenkins and Hayes, matching their pace, keeping her spacing. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute except for the starlight overhead. She could hear her own breathing inside her helmet, the soft crunch of boots on hard ground, the rustle of gear. They entered the village through a gap in a crumbling wall. Buildings loomed on either side, creating dark canyons of shadow. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. Every doorway could hide a threat. Every window could contain a weapon. She swept her rifle slowly from side to side, following her training. Watching for movement, the team reached the target compound. It was a larger structure than the surrounding buildings, with high walls and a heavy wooden door. Captain Hendricks and the first team were already positioned at the door. He made hand signals, counting down. 3, 2, 1. The door exploded inward with a controlled breach. Soldiers flooded through the opening, their voices sharp and commanding. "Clear, moving, door right." Sarah entered with her team, immediately moving to the left side of the courtyard as instructed. The compound had an open central area with rooms along the perimeter. Soldiers were clearing each room systematically, their movements precise and coordinated. Then everything went wrong. Gunfire erupted from a second-story window. The sharp crack of AK-47 rounds split the air. Sarah dropped behind a low wall as bullets kicked up dust across the courtyard. She could hear men shouting, returning fire, the chaos of combat crashing over everything. Contact second floor. Multiple shooters covering fire on that window. "We've got wounded medic." The call cut through everything else. Sarah's training took over. She moved without thinking, keeping low, running toward the voice. Specialist Chen was down near the doorway to one of the rooms, clutching his leg. Blood was pooling beneath him, dark and spreading fast. Sarah slid to her knees beside him, her hands already reaching for her medical kit. Bullets were still flying overhead. Someone was providing covering fire, but she barely registered it. Her entire focus narrowed to Chen and his injury. "I've got you," she said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She cut away his pant leg with trauma shears, exposing the wound. Arterial blood was spurting with each heartbeat. Femoral artery hit, just as she had memorized in her protocols. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. She packed the wound with gauze, applying direct pressure while reaching for a tourniquet with her other hand. Chen was gasping, his face pale even in the dim light. "Stay with me. Chen, you're going to be fine." She got the tourniquet high on his thigh, cranked it tight, marking the time on his forehead with a marker she kept in her pocket. The spurting slowed, then stopped. She checked his pulse, his breathing, his level of consciousness. More gunfire rattled above them. Someone shouted that the second floor was clear, but Sarah barely heard it. She was starting an IV line on Chen, getting fluids running, preparing him for evacuation. His blood pressure was dropping. She called out to the nearest soldier, "I need a litter team." Priority evacuation. 2 soldiers appeared with a stretcher. Together, they loaded Chen onto it. Sarah kept her hand on his pulse as they carried him toward the courtyard entrance. His heartbeat was steady, but present. He was going into shock, but he was alive. They got him to the staging area outside the compound where the vehicles waited. Sarah continued treatment, monitoring his vitals, adjusting the tourniquet, ensuring the IV was flowing. A medevac helicopter was already inbound. Called as soon as the casualties were reported. Good work, Martinez. Sergeant Davis appeared beside her, his own hands bloody from treating another wounded soldier nearby. Keep him stable until the bird arrives. She nodded, not taking her eyes off Chen. The helicopter arrived 10 minutes later, motors beating the air, kicking up dust and debris. They loaded Chen aboard along with 2 other casualties. Sarah gave the flight medic a quick report on Chen's injuries and treatment, then watched the helicopter lift off into the lightning sky. Only then did she allow herself to feel the tremor in her hands, the weakness in her legs. She had just treated her first combat casualty. She had worked under fire. She had saved a life. But there was no time to process it. The mission was still ongoing. The target had been captured, but the compound needed to be searched and cleared. She returned with her team to continue their work. Dawn was breaking as they finished. The village was secured, the target was in custody, and the casualties had been evacuated. The platoon gathered for a head count before loading back into the vehicles. Sarah's uniform was stiff with dried blood. Her gear felt heavier than ever. She was exhausted in a way she had never experienced before. In the vehicle, on the ride back, the atmosphere was different. Soldiers talked in low voices, processing what had happened. Jenkins sat next to Sarah, and after a long silence, he spoke. "You did good back there. Chen's alive because of you." "Just did my job," she replied, but she felt something shift in the space between them. Hayes, sitting across from her, nodded. "Serious skills, Doc." "For real?" When they returned to Fob Sentinel, Captain Hendricks gathered the platoon for a debrief. He went through the mission timeline, discussing what went right and what could be improved. Then he looked directly at Sarah. Specialist Martinez performed her duties with courage and competence under fire. Chen is in stable condition at the field hospital because of her immediate and effective treatment. Well done, Martinez. The platoon was silent for a moment, then someone started clapping. Others joined in. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of acceptance. Over the following days, something changed in how the soldiers of 3rd Platoon treated Sarah. They still tested her, still watched her work, but the open hostility was gone. Men started asking her medical questions genuinely, seeking her expertise. A few even invited her to join their card games in the evenings. Sergeant Davis assigned her to more training exercises with the platoon, teaching combat lifesaver skills to soldiers who needed certification. She found herself working alongside men who had previously ignored her, listening intently to her instructions on how to apply tourniquets or pack wounds. 2 weeks after the first mission, they deployed again, this time to provide medical support during a village engagement operation. Sarah treated a local child who had stepped on unexploded ordnance, stabilizing him for transport to a hospital. She worked with an Afghan woman who was in difficult labor, helping deliver a baby in a mud brick home while soldiers provided security outside. Each mission built on the last. Each success added another layer to her credibility. But she never became complacent. She knew that one mistake could undo all the trust she had earned. So she continued to train, continued to study, continued to prove herself every single day. One evening, about 6 weeks into her deployment, she was sitting in the medical bay reorganizing supplies when 3 soldiers from 3rd Platoon entered. She recognized them as some of the men who had made disparaging comments about her on her first day. One of them, a corporal named Stevens, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Hey, Martinez. We wanted to say something." She looked up from her inventory list, waiting. "We were pretty rough on you when you first got here," Stevens continued. "Made some comments that weren't cool. We just wanted to say we were wrong. You're solid. You're one of us now." Sarah felt emotion tighten her throat, but kept her expression neutral. "Appreciate that." They nodded and started to leave, but Stevens turned back. "Also, if anyone gives you grief, you let us know. We take care of our own." After they left, Sarah sat alone in the medical bay and allowed herself a small smile. She had made it over the first major hurdle. She was no longer the outsider, the unknown variable, the woman they weren't sure belonged. She was Martinez, their medic, a member of 3rd Platoon. But she also knew the real challenges still lay ahead. Combat was unpredictable. The enemy didn't care about her progress or her acceptance. The next mission could be routine, or it could be catastrophic. She had to stay sharp, stay ready, stay focused. That night, she wrote a letter to Miguel. She told him about the work she was doing, about saving lives in impossible situations, about finding her purpose in the chaos. She didn't tell him about the danger, about the fear, about the weight of responsibility that sometimes felt crushing. She only told him that she was exactly where she needed to be. The next morning, Captain Hendricks called another platoon meeting. Sarah filed in with the others, noting the serious expressions on the faces of the command staff. This wouldn't be a routine patrol or a simple engagement operation. Hendricks waited until everyone was seated before speaking. "We've received intelligence about a major insurgent operation being planned in the mountain region to our north. Multiple high-value targets are gathering for a coordination meeting. Higher command wants us to conduct a raid on their location. This will be the most complex mission we've attempted this deployment." He pulled up satellite imagery showing rugged mountain terrain, cluster of buildings in a narrow valley, multiple approach routes. "The target is heavily defended. We expect significant resistance. This is a full platoon operation with air support. Every person needs to be at the top of their game." His eyes found Sarah in the group. "Martinez, you'll be forward with the assault teams. We expect casualties. This won't be like anything you've faced so far." She met his gaze and nodded. "Understood, sir." As the briefing continued with tactical details and contingency plans, Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission tension building. But beneath the anxiety was something new: confidence. The men around her were depending on her skills, trusting her competence. She wouldn't let them down. The mission was scheduled for 3 days out, giving them time to prepare and rehearse. Sarah spent those days checking and rechecking her medical supplies, running through scenarios in her mind, training her body to handle the physical demands that would be required. She also spent time talking with the other medics on base, getting their advice and insights. Sergeant Davis walked her through the most likely injury patterns they would face in a mountain firefight, how to prioritize casualties when resources were limited, how to make impossible decisions under pressure. "The hardest part isn't the medical skills," Davis told her during one of these sessions. "You've got those down. The hardest part is keeping your head when everything is falling apart around you. When men are screaming, when bullets are flying, when you have to decide which casualty gets treatment first, knowing that decision means someone else might die. How do you handle that?" Sarah asked. Davis was quiet for a moment. "You trust your training. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, and you don't second-guess yourself in the moment. Second-guessing gets people killed. You save who you can save, and you live with the rest." His words stayed with her as the mission day approached. She understood now that being a combat medic wasn't just about medical knowledge. It was about leadership under pressure, about making life-and-death decisions in seconds, about carrying the weight of those decisions afterward. The night before the mission, she couldn't sleep again. She lay in her cot, thinking about all the things that could go wrong, all the ways she might fail, all the lives that would depend on her performance. The doubt crept back in, whispering that maybe she wasn't ready, wasn't strong enough, wasn't good enough. But then she remembered Chen, alive because of her actions. She remembered the Afghan child she had stabilized, the baby she had helped deliver. She remembered every patient she had treated, every life she had touched. She had already proven herself capable. Tomorrow, she would do it again. The helicopters lifted off from FOB Sentinel at 0400, their rotors cutting through the cold mountain air. Sarah sat wedged between Jenkins and Hayes in the Black Hawk, the familiar weight of her gear pressing against her body. Through the open door, she could see the dark landscape rolling beneath them, mountains rising like jagged teeth against the starlit sky. This insertion was different from her previous missions. They were flying deeper into hostile territory, into terrain that favored the enemy. The intelligence reports had been clear about the number of insurgents gathered at the target location. This wouldn't be a quick raid. This would be a sustained firefight. The flight took 30 minutes. Nobody spoke over the roar of the engines. Sarah checked her medical supplies for the dozenth time, running through her mental checklist. Tourniquets, combat gauze, chest seals, nasopharyngeal airways, 4 kits, medications. Everything was exactly where it should be, organized for quick access in the dark. The helicopter began its descent. Sarah's stomach lurched as they dropped rapidly toward the landing zone. Through the door, she could see the target valley ahead, a narrow gorge with steep sides and a small cluster of buildings at the bottom. The other helicopters in their formation were visible as dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. 50 feet from the ground, the crew chief held up his hand. 30 seconds. Sarah gripped her rifle tighter. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Around her, soldiers were tensed and ready, their faces set in expressions of controlled intensity. The helicopter flared and touched down. Go, go, go. Sarah jumped out with the others, boots hitting rocky ground. She ran toward the rally point, keeping low, her team around her. The helicopters lifted off immediately, their rotor wash kicking up dust and debris. Then they were gone, and the platoon was alone in enemy territory. Captain Hendricks directed teams to their positions with hand signals. The target buildings were 200 meters ahead, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah moved with Lieutenant Morrison's element, staying in her designated position between Jenkins and another soldier named Rodriguez. They advanced slowly, using the terrain for cover. The mountains rose steeply on both sides of the valley, creating natural choke points. Sarah's night vision goggles turned the world green and ghostly. She could see her teammates spread out in tactical formation, weapons tracking potential threats. The first shots came from the hillside to their right. Muzzle flashes sparked in the darkness, and bullets cracked past Sarah's head. She dropped behind a boulder as the entire platoon returned fire, the night exploding into chaos. Contact, right? Multiple positions on the hillside. Suppressive fire on those rocks. Sarah pressed herself against the boulder, her medical instincts screaming at her to help, but her tactical training keeping her in cover. She couldn't treat casualties if she got shot. She had to wait for the call. The firefight intensified. Insurgents were firing from multiple positions, using the high ground to their advantage. The platoon was pinned down, unable to advance toward the target buildings. Captain Hendricks was on the radio calling for air support, his voice calm despite the chaos. Then Sarah heard the call she had been dreading and expecting. Medic, we've got wounded on the left flank. She moved without hesitation, sprinting in a low crouch toward the call. Bullets snapped through the air around her. She reached the wounded soldier, a man named Peterson, who was lying behind a cluster of rocks. Blood covered his shoulder and arm. Sarah dropped her medical pack and went to work. The wound was from a through-and-through gunshot, missing major arteries, but causing significant tissue damage. She packed the wound, applied pressure, started an IV. Peterson was conscious and talking, which was a good sign. "How bad, Doc?" he asked through gritted teeth. "You'll live. You're getting a Purple Heart and a trip home." She secured the bandages and marked him for evacuation. "Can you stay here and cover?" "Yeah." "Go help the others." She grabbed her pack and moved to the next casualty. Specialist Warren had taken shrapnel from a grenade, multiple wounds across his legs and torso. This was more serious. She worked quickly, prioritizing the life-threatening injuries, stopping bleeding, protecting his airway. Around her, the firefight continued, but she blocked it out. Her world narrowed to Warren and his injuries. A third casualty was called in. Then a fourth. Sarah moved between them, triaging, treating, stabilizing. Her hands were covered in blood. Her muscles burned from the constant movement while carrying her heavy pack. But she never stopped, never hesitated. An explosion rocked the valley. One of the helicopters had returned, and an Apache gunship was engaging the enemy positions on the hillside. The heavy weapons fire from the helicopter was devastating, tearing through the insurgent positions. The enemy fire began to slacken. All elements, advance, Captain Hendricks ordered. The platoon moved forward toward the target buildings. Sarah stayed with the casualties, continuing treatment and preparing them for evacuation. Jenkins and 2 other soldiers remained with her as security, while the rest of the platoon pushed ahead. The next medevac helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, hovering low while soldiers loaded the wounded. Sarah gave quick reports to the flight medic for each casualty, ensuring continuity of care. Then the helicopter lifted off, and she was running forward to rejoin her team. The target buildings were now surrounded by 3rd Platoon. The primary objective had been secured, but the fight wasn't over. Insurgents were still positioned in the surrounding hills, taking shots at the platoon whenever they had opportunities. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the mountain peaks in shades of orange and red. Sarah reached Lieutenant Morrison's position at one of the buildings. He was coordinating with his team leaders, planning their next move. He glanced at Sarah when she arrived. "For more wounded inside the building. Can you handle them while we clear the rest of the compound?" "Yes, sir." As she entered the structure, a simple 2-room building with concrete walls. 4 soldiers were there, 2 with minor wounds, 2 more serious. She assessed each one quickly, prioritizing based on severity. One had a gunshot wound to the abdomen that required immediate attention. She went to work on him while giving instructions to the others on how to treat their own injuries or help their buddies. The soldier with the abdominal wound was named Ramirez. He was 19 years old, scared and significant pain. Sarah talked to him while she worked, keeping him calm, explaining what she was doing. She couldn't operate, couldn't fix the internal damage, but she could stabilize him until he reached a surgical team. "Stay with me, Ramirez. You're doing great. I need you to keep breathing nice and steady." That's it. She got for access, started fluids, applied a pressure dressing to the entry wound. His blood pressure was dropping. She elevated his legs, kept him warm with emergency blankets. Every skill she had learned, every scenario she had practiced, all of it was being used right now. Another explosion outside. More gunfire. The battle was still raging. But inside this room, Sarah's battle was against blood loss and shock. She monitored Ramirez constantly, adjusting his position, checking his vitals, ready to perform more aggressive interventions if necessary. Sergeant Davis appeared in the doorway. "How's it looking?" "Ramirez needs immediate surgical evacuation. The others can wait for the next bird." Davis nodded. "Birds inbound, 2 minutes." "Good work, Martinez." He disappeared to coordinate the evacuation. Sarah stayed with Ramirez, her hand on his pulse, counting each heartbeat. 2 minutes felt like an eternity. But then she heard the helicopter, and soldiers were bringing in a litter. They loaded Ramirez carefully, and Sarah went with him to the landing zone. The helicopter settled in a cloud of dust. They loaded Ramirez aboard, and Sarah gave her report to the flight medic, shouting to be heard over the rotors. Then the helicopter was gone, and she was alone at the landing zone, covered in blood, exhausted beyond measure. But the mission wasn't over. She made her way back to the compound, where 3rd Platoon was consolidating their position. The sun was fully up now, revealing the extent of the battlefield. Bullet holes pocked the buildings. Shell casings littered the ground. The smell of cordite and blood hung in the air. Captain Hendricks was setting up a command post in the largest building. He saw Sarah and waved her over. "Martinez, I need a casualty count." "How many did we evacuate? And what are their statuses?" She gave him the rundown from memory. 6 total evacuations. 2 routine, for priority. Peterson, shoulder wound, stable. Warren, shrapnel injuries, stable but serious. Ramirez, abdominal GSW, critical but alive. Jenkins has a broken wrist from when he fell, but he's staying with us. Thompson has minor burns from an explosion. Davis has a concussion but refused evacuation. Hendricks was taking notes. "Expected survival for all of them?" "Yes, sir. If they get to surgery in time, they should all make it." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. "You saved lives today, Martinez. No question about it." Before she could respond, gunfire erupted again. Insurgents were attacking from a different position, trying to flank the platoon's location. Sarah grabbed her rifle and moved to cover with the nearest fire team. This wasn't a medical situation anymore. This was a fight for survival. The battle continued for another 2 hours. The Apache gunships returned, providing devastating close air support. The insurgents eventually broke contact and retreated deeper into the mountains. 3rd Platoon had successfully completed their mission, captured the high-value targets, and held their position despite overwhelming enemy presence. But the cost had been high. 8 soldiers wounded, though thankfully none killed. Sarah had treated every one of them, working under fire, making split-second decisions that determined who lived and who might have died. The extraction helicopters arrived in the early afternoon. The platoon loaded up, securing their prisoners and their wounded. Sarah collapsed into a seat on the helicopter, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion. Her hands were still shaking. Her uniform was stiff with dried blood. Her body ached in ways she had never experienced. Jenkins sat down next to her and handed her a bottle of water. She drank gratefully, the cold liquid cutting through the dust in her throat. "You're a legend now. You know that?" Jenkins said. "I just did my job." "Yeah, but you did it better than anyone I've ever seen. You saved Ramirez. He was circling the drain, and you brought him back. That's not just doing your job. That's being exceptional." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She had never sought recognition. She had only wanted to be competent, to be accepted, to be allowed to do the work she had trained for. But somewhere in the chaos of combat, she had become something more than competent. She had become someone her fellow soldiers trusted completely. The flight back to FOB Sentinel felt shorter than the flight out. Sarah watched the mountains recede behind them. Thinking about the men she had treated, the decisions she had made, the lives that had hung in the balance, she had made the right calls. She had kept her head. She had done everything Sergeant Davis had told her she would need to do. When they landed at the base, medical personnel were waiting to do assessment checks on everyone. Sarah went through the process automatically, answering questions, allowing them to check her for injuries she might not have noticed in the adrenaline. She was cleared with nothing more than bruises and exhaustion. Captain Hendricks gathered the platoon one more time before dismissing them. "I know you're all exhausted, but I want you to know that what you did today will be studied and discussed at higher levels. You executed a complex mission in difficult terrain against a determined enemy. You achieved all objectives. And most importantly, every single person is coming home alive because you took care of each other." He paused, looking around at his soldiers. "I'm proud to serve with each and every one of you. Get some rest. We'll debrief tomorrow." As the group dispersed, several soldiers approached Sarah. They shook her hand, thanked her, told her stories of what they had seen her do during the battle. She was overwhelmed by the attention, but tried to accept it gracefully. Sergeant Davis was the last to approach. "I was wrong about you," he said simply. "When you first arrived, I didn't think you had what it takes. I was wrong, and I'm man enough to admit it. You're one of the best combat medics I've ever worked with." "Thank you, Sergeant. That means a lot, should. Because I don't say things I don't mean." He nodded once, then walked away. Sarah made her way to her barracks, wanting nothing more than to shower and sleep. But when she entered her small room, she found a group of soldiers waiting for her. They had brought food from the dining facility and had set up an impromptu celebration. "We figured you wouldn't want to deal with the crowd in the DFAC," Stevens explained. "So we brought the food to you. Everyone wanted to do something to say thanks." They spent an hour together, eating and talking about the mission, processing the intensity of what they had experienced. For the first time since arriving at FOB Sentinel, Sarah felt completely included. She wasn't the female medic anymore. She wasn't the outsider. She was simply Martinez, one of them, a valued member of the team. That night, after everyone had left and she was finally alone, Sarah sat on her cot and allowed herself to feel everything she had pushed down during the mission. The fear, the stress, the weight of responsibility. Tears came, and she didn't fight them. She cried for Ramirez lying on the ground with his life bleeding out. She cried for Peterson and Warren and all the others who had been hurt. She cried for herself and the impossible burden of being the person who decided who lived and who died. But when the tears stopped, she felt lighter. She had carried men through the worst moments of their lives. She had made impossible decisions under impossible circumstances. She had proven herself not just to the men of 3rd Platoon, but to herself. She pulled out her photograph of Miguel and looked at his smiling face. "I did it," she whispered to the image. "I became the person who saves lives when it matters most." The days following the mountain mission passed in a strange blur. Sarah moved through her routines with the mechanical precision of deep exhaustion. But underneath the fatigue, something fundamental had shifted. The base felt different now. Or perhaps she felt different in it. Soldiers she had never spoken to before nodded to her in passing. Officers she had only seen from a distance stopped to ask her opinion on medical protocols. The dining facility, once a place where she sat alone, became somewhere she couldn't find an empty table because people kept inviting her to join them. 3 days after the mission, word came down that Ramirez had made it through surgery and was stable at the military hospital in Germany. The news spread through 3rd Platoon like wildfire. Several soldiers came to find Sarah personally to tell her, as if she might not have heard. As if they needed to share the victory with her specifically. "He's going to make it," Rodriguez told her, his eyes bright. "The doctor said another 15 minutes and he would have bled out. But you kept him alive long enough." Sarah felt the weight of those words settle into her chest alongside all the other weights she carried. Another life saved. Another family that wouldn't receive the worst news imaginable. Another soldier who would go home to the people who loved him. Captain Hendricks called her to his office that afternoon. She reported as ordered, standing at attention before his desk while he finished reading a document. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "Tease. Martinez. Sit down." She sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "I've been writing reports about the mountain operation," he began. "Specifically, I've been detailing the actions of certain individuals whose performance exceeded expectations under extreme circumstances." Sarah remained silent, unsure where this was going. "I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star with Valor," Hendricks said. "Your actions during the mission directly saved the lives of 6 soldiers. You provided medical treatment under heavy enemy fire without hesitation or regard for your own safety. That's the definition of valor, Martinez." She felt her breath catch. The Bronze Star was a significant commendation, not something she had ever imagined receiving. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "No." His voice was firm. "Doing your job would have been treating casualties after the fighting stopped. You ran through active fire zones to reach wounded soldiers. You worked on Ramirez while bullets were impacting within meters of your position. You made decisions that required not just medical knowledge, but extraordinary courage. That's not just doing your job. That's heroism." Sarah didn't know what to say. She had never thought of herself as heroic. She had simply responded to the training and the need in front of her. Hendricks leaned back in his chair. "When you first arrived here, I had doubts. I'm not proud of that, but I'm honest enough to admit it. I thought you might be competent, but I didn't know if you would have the courage required for forward combat operations. You've proven me wrong in every possible way. Thank you, sir. I'm also recommending you for a promotion. And I'm going to make sure that every commanding officer in this theater knows your name and what you're capable of. The military needs more medics like you, Martinez. People who don't just have the skills, but have the heart to use them when it matters most." She left his office feeling overwhelmed. Recognition had never been her goal. She couldn't deny that it felt meaningful to have her work acknowledged by someone she respected that evening. Sergeant Davis found her in the medical bay, where she was reorganizing supplies. He watched her work for a moment before speaking. "I heard about the Bronze Star recommendation. News travels fast. On a fob this size, everything travels fast." He moved to help her, lifting a heavy box of 4 fluids onto a high shelf. "You deserve it. And not just because you saved lives, though that's obviously the most important part. You deserve it because you changed the culture of this platoon." Sarah looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "When you first got here, there was a lot of resistance to having a female medic. Not from everyone, but from enough people that it created a toxic environment. You could have responded with anger or defensiveness. Instead, you just kept showing up, kept being excellent at your job, kept proving yourself through action rather than argument. You showed these men that gender doesn't determine capability. That's a bigger impact than most people realize. I just wanted to be allowed to do my job, I know. But in doing that, you changed minds and opened doors. There will be other female soldiers who come after you, and their path will be easier because of the example you set. After he left, Sarah sat alone in the medical bay thinking about his words. She had never considered herself a trailblazer or a role model. She had simply wanted to serve, to use her skills where they were needed most. But Davis was right that her presence had forced the men of 3rd Platoon to confront their assumptions and biases. The following weeks brought more missions, though none as intense as the mountain operation. Sarah treated injuries ranging from minor wounds to serious trauma. Each time, she approached the work with the same focus and dedication that had become her hallmark. She also began teaching more. Formal classes on combat medical care, training soldiers throughout the base on life-saving techniques. Her classes were always full, with soldiers requesting specific skills they wanted to learn. She discovered she had a talent for teaching, breaking down complex medical procedures into steps that anyone could understand and execute under stress. One afternoon, she was approached by a young female soldier from another unit who had recently arrived at the FOB. The woman, a private first class named Emily Thompson, looked nervous as she waited for Sarah to finish inventory checks. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked. "I'm sorry to bother you, Specialist Martinez. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm with the logistics company, and I've heard a lot about you since I got here." "Nothing too bad, I hope," Sarah said with a slight smile. "No, all good things. About how you saved lives during that big mission. About how the guys in 3rd Platoon respect you." Thompson hesitated, then continued. "I guess I just wanted to meet you. There aren't many of us women out here in forward positions. It's good to know someone is making it work." Sarah recognized the uncertainty in the young woman's eyes. She had felt that same uncertainty when she first arrived. "How are they treating you in your unit?" "Okay, mostly. Some comments here and there, nothing I can't handle. But I was wondering if maybe sometime you could tell me how you dealt with it when you first got here. How you got them to take you seriously?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I don't think there's a magic formula. But what worked for me was being undeniably excellent at my job and not reacting to provocations. Every time someone questioned my abilities, I let my work speak for itself. Eventually, competence wins out over prejudice. It takes time, and it's not always fair that we have to prove ourselves more than male soldiers do. But it's the reality we're working with." They talked for another 20 minutes. Sarah sharing insights from her experiences and Thompson asking thoughtful questions about handling various situations. When the young soldier finally left, Sarah felt a sense of responsibility she hadn't expected. She was setting an example whether she wanted to or not. Other women were watching her, taking courage from her success. 2 months into her deployment, Sarah was approaching the medical bay when she heard raised voices inside. She entered to find 2 soldiers arguing, one of them Corporal Stevens from 3rd Platoon. "What's going on?" she asked. The other soldier, someone she didn't recognize from another unit, turned to her. "Your friend here thinks he can tell me how to do medical training. Last I checked, he's not a medic." "I'm telling you what Martinez taught us," Stevens said, his voice tight with frustration. "The new tourniquet protocol is more effective than what you're teaching your guys." Sarah stepped between them. "Let's all take a breath. Stevens, why don't you show me what you're talking about?" Stevens demonstrated the tourniquet application technique she had taught 3rd Platoon, explaining the methodology and the research behind it. The other soldier watched skeptically at first. But as Stevens worked through the demonstration with clear competence, his expression changed. "That is actually better than what we were shown," he admitted grudgingly. "Martinez is the best medic on this base," Stevens said with conviction. "If you want your soldiers to survive when they're wounded, you should be learning from her, not arguing." The situation diffused, and the other soldier actually asked if he could attend Sarah's next training session. After he left, Stevens turned to Sarah with a sheepish grin. "Sorry if I overstepped, but I get annoyed when people don't recognize how good you are at this." "I appreciate you having my back," Sarah said. "But next time, maybe don't start arguments in my medical bay." "Fair enough." The incident stayed with Sarah. Stevens, who had been one of the soldiers making disparaging comments when she first arrived, was now defending her competence to others. The transformation in how 3rd Platoon viewed her was complete. But she also knew that respect was something that had to be maintained, not just earned once. Every mission, every treatment, every decision was another opportunity to either reinforce the trust she had built or damage it. She couldn't afford to become complacent or overconfident. A month later, 3rd Platoon deployed on what was supposed to be a routine village engagement. Sarah went with her usual team, expecting another day of treating minor ailments and building relationships with local Afghans. Instead, they walked into an ambush. The insurgents had been waiting, had planned their attack carefully. The platoon was caught in a kill zone with limited cover and heavy fire coming from multiple directions. Within the first 30 seconds, 5 soldiers were wounded. Sarah moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, but this was different from the mountain mission. There were more casualties, less cover, and the enemy fire was more concentrated. She worked on Specialist Hayes first, who had taken a round through the thigh. As she was applying the tourniquet, an RPG exploded 20 meters away, the blast wave knocking her sideways. Her ears rang. Her vision blurred for a moment, but she shook it off and finished securing the tourniquet on Hayes. Then she moved to the next casualty, then the next. She worked through the casualty collection point they had established behind a low wall, triaging, treating, making impossible decisions about who needed care first. Lieutenant Morrison was coordinating the defense, calling in air support and trying to maneuver the platoon to a better position. But they were pinned down, and the casualties kept mounting. Sarah's medical supplies were running low. Her hands were cramping from the constant work, but she never stopped. An Afghan interpreter attached to the platoon was hit by shrapnel. Sarah worked on him alongside the American soldiers, treating his injuries with the same care and urgency. He was conscious, scared, bleeding from multiple wounds. "Stay with me," she told him in the limited Pashto she had learned. "You're going to be okay." The Apache helicopters arrived and changed the battle. Their heavy weapons fired devastated the enemy positions, and the insurgents began to withdraw. But the damage was done. 9 American soldiers wounded, 1 Afghan interpreter critical, and the platoon was still taking sporadic fire. Sarah had been working for 2 hours straight when the medevac helicopters finally arrived. She helped load every casualty, giving detailed reports to the flight medics, ensuring continuity of care. When the last helicopter lifted off, she collapsed against the wall, her energy completely spent. Sergeant Davis appeared beside her, his own uniform torn and bloody. "How many did we lose?" "None. Everyone's alive. Some are critical, but they were all breathing when they left." Davis looked at her with something like, 9 casualties in an ambush that heavy, and you kept all of them alive. That's remarkable, Martinez." She was too exhausted to feel pride. She could only feel relief that she had been enough, that her skills had been sufficient, that everyone would have a chance to go home. The platoon made it back to Fob Sentinel that evening, battered but intact. The next day, Captain Hendricks gathered them for a debrief. The mission had been a tactical defeat in many ways. They had been ambushed, had taken heavy casualties, hadn't achieved their objectives. But it had also been a human victory because every soldier who had been wounded was going to survive. "I want to specifically acknowledge Specialist Martinez," Hendricks said during the debrief. She treated 9 casualties under continuous fire for over 2 hours. Her performance was nothing short of extraordinary. Because of her actions, every member of this platoon who was wounded yesterday is alive today. The room erupted in applause. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes but blinked them back. These men who had once doubted her, who had questioned whether a woman belonged in combat, were now applauding her without reservation or qualification. After the debrief, soldiers lined up to thank her personally. Some shook her hand. Some hugged her. Hayes, whose life she had saved with that tourniquet in the first seconds of the ambush, could barely speak through his emotion. "I have a wife and a daughter," he said. "Because of you, I'm going to see them again. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay." But his words, and the words of all the others, settled into her heart. This was why she had endured every doubt, every challenge, every moment of feeling like an outsider. This was the purpose she had been seeking since she watched paramedics save Miguel's life. That night, Sarah sat in her room writing letters. One to Miguel, telling him about the work she was doing and how much his survival had inspired her path. One to her parents, being vague about the dangers, but honest about the fulfillment she felt. And one to herself, documenting her thoughts and feelings about this deployment, about what she had learned about courage and competence and the power of persistence. The Bronze Star with Valor was officially approved 3 weeks later. There was a small ceremony where Captain Hendricks pinned the medal to her uniform in front of the entire base. Standing there in formation, wearing the recognition of her courage and skill, Sarah thought about how far she had come from that first day at FOB Sentinel. She had arrived as an unknown quantity, a female soldier in a male-dominated environment, someone who had to prove her worth every single day. She was leaving as a legend, someone whose name would be spoken in 3rd Platoon for years to come, someone who had changed perceptions and opened doors for those who would follow. But more important than the medal or the recognition was the knowledge that she had become exactly who she set out to be. She was a combat medic who saved lives under the worst possible circumstances. She was a soldier her teammates trusted completely. She was someone who had faced every challenge with courage and competence. The deployment continued for another 4 months, but the worst was behind them. Sarah continued her work, treating casualties, training soldiers, building the reputation that would follow her throughout her military career. When she finally boarded the flight home at the end of her 8-month deployment, she carried with her the memories of every life saved, every challenge overcome. Every moment when she had been tested and had proven herself equal to the task. Years later, when Sarah had risen through the ranks and was training the next generation of combat medics, she would tell them the story of her first deployment. She would talk about the doubt and the challenge and the moments of fear, but she would also talk about the power of persistence, importance of excellence, and the simple truth that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And she would tell them that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in dramatic battles, but in the quiet accumulation of competent work, day after day, until respect is earned and doors are opened and barriers fall away. She had been ridiculed as the new recruit. By dawn after that mountain mission, she had become something far more important. She had become someone her team could depend on when everything else had fallen apart. That, she would tell them, was what it meant to be a combat medic. That was what it meant to serve. And that was worth every moment of doubt and challenge along the way.